Hello there, my friend, and welcome to the Ayurveda and Psychology podcast. I am Charlotte Skogsberg, your host for this podcast. I am enchanted to meet and to take you with me on this journey into the human psyche, viewed from the holistic approach of yoga and Ayurveda, and viewed from the modern man approach of clinical psychology and psychoanalysis. So have something nice to drink next to you, maybe a cup of tea, have a seat, or go out for a nice walk in nature maybe. Enjoy. Today's episode will be focusing on Ayurveda, and I've chosen to call it Why Quick Fixes Don't Work. Now, it could almost be an episode on psychology as well, and this is where it's so wonderful to see that the ancient practices of yoga and Ayurveda are so aligned with what modern science has come to confirm through experience. That we've done, different kinds of experiences that's been done with the modern instruments today that can measure the brain, for instance, and see the activity in the brain through neuroscience, through behaviorism, of course, as well, and just by understanding our mind better. Things like addiction, for instance, and obsessive thoughts and these kind of things are also being explained in modern science through this, and it really just relies on the same pillars as the ancient practices of Ayurveda and yoga. And so naturally, I could just go on talking about this forever because it combines then the perfect episode of yoga and psychology and Ayurveda. But we will come from an Ayurvedic perspective most specifically today. So, one of the most important things to understand when it comes to our health is that if we could simply live according to our natural constitution from day one and on, we would never have to cure anything. This is where there's a big difference between how Ayurvedic medicine deals with our issues compared to modern medicine that deals with our issues once they've occurred. So in modern medicine, we heal through curing diseases, whereas in Ayurveda, we heal through preventing diseases. And just like anything else in nature, if we would be capable of living according to our own natural progression, then we would actually not have to cure anything, really. So the first thing to understand from the Ayurvedic perspective is that instead of trying to deal with things once they've gone wrong, what we try to do is to live in a certain logic so that these problems don't really occur. That is the reason as well, of course, that we talk more about lifestyle and lifestyle choices than anything else. We've come into this moment, I find, in time right now, especially since a couple of years, or maybe not since a couple of years, but I see it even more now, where there's promises of perfection, let's say, all around, if we just go with different kinds of quick fixes. And that is whether it's a question of your, altogether physical health, your digestive system, your mental health, your emotional. And it's really this wanting to put people and issues into categories and into boxes to simplify things, and from that perspective then just say, well, if you've gone into that box with that label on it, then I'll give you this pill that will fix it. It's really that kind of mechanical perspective on the universe and on life in general and on our organisms. As humans, we are always, of course, seeking to feel at ease, and we do not wish to use too much of our energy. So naturally, if there is a promise of an instant, let's say, satisfaction, then we will reach for it. It's just the way our brains are made. However, since we've also come to notice that these instant fixes don't really either work at all or won't last in the long run, we have also become quite disappointed in the promises that basically started with advertising, right? So when they started to advertise back in, well, let's say post Second World War, we would believe in advertisement to much greater extent than we do today, because we have then been desensitized, I should say, to a lot of the messages that we would receive when this just started. Like everything else, it's like when it's new, it just seems fresh and promising, and we don't have so much experience to lean back on in order to say, I believe this or I don't believe this. And I find that that's also what we're experiencing now. It's just that we've changed the way we receive the information. So the advertising is still happening. It's just been modified because what used to be fresh has now become so normalized that we don't really respond to it the same way anymore. So we always need this new way in order for someone to buy into it, right? And then we get disappointed when it doesn't work. And what very often happens is that we then go back to old ways of doing things, old habits, for instance. And this is why, of course, we tend to go through life without really changing much of what we do. Let me just unpack that one for a second. I think that it sounds maybe not very positive what I just said, but it is true that we have, come into this life with our ways of doing things that we've learned from childhood and through adolescence and then into early adulthood and so on and so forth. And we've developed these habits that just become so familiar to us that it's second nature, right? So it's not even second nature, it's our nature. It feels like. They might not be very helpful. And so when we get these promises of, solving our issues in whatever way, we will try for them. And then when that doesn't work, we become disappointed and we might try something new. And we do that a couple of times until we decide that none of that actually works. And we go back to the old habits. We go back to the old habits that don't work either. But because that's what's familiar for us, we just feel more comfortable with it. So then we kind of make our way around it by saying that this is just, me. So this is why trying something new that isn't long-lasting is hard for us to trust. And we will buy into it first because of the promise, and then we will be disappointed. And that's also why we get into that kind of yo-yo effect when it comes to a lot of different things. That is the different kinds of diet that people try out. It is also this case for, buying new outfits and then looking into your closet and say that you've got nothing to wear. But it's, it's so full you can't even close it. But of course, in your opinion, there's nothing to wear in there. And that is linked to the way our mind functions, like I was explaining just a few minutes back. It's the fact that we are always going for what's familiar, that we're interested in quick fixes because it means that it's less energy to use. And then because it is quick fixes, they don't really stick with us. So what we need to do, now this is what you really need to pay attention to, is we need to do things that we are capable of sticking with. I'm not saying that the quick fixes that are promised to us are not, in essence, true or helpful. It's the fact that it is not something that we can stick to that makes it detrimental to changing anything that we have. So the way that Ayurveda then looked at it was, instead of going for this kind of yo-yoing, going up and down and up and down and back into old habits and trying something new and then going back into old habits and such. So Ayurveda said instead, okay, what you need to do is that you need to tap into what is your really natural flow, which is one of the ease, because if it's what's natural to you, then you are actually living in your true essence. And when you're living in your true essence, you actually do feel ease. And let me assure you on this, there's no reason for the universe in itself to exist if it's supposed to be a struggle. If it's something that just happens naturally and just continues by itself, then yes, that makes sense. And if you would just look into nature, you'll see this all around you. If we leave something in nature be without us intervening in it, you will see it just growing and growing and growing. And yes, we might then come in and cut it down or whatever we do with it because it doesn't suit us in whatever we want it to be. But if you would not look at it from that perspective, you can see that it's actually just going in its own flow and it's of ease and it just continues, right? So by installing for ourselves a rhythm in life that is our natural flow, then number one, we will find ease. And if we can do that from day one, then there's no adaptation into it. It just happens just like any other animal or any plant. We just go with our ease. Now, that is not the case in the society that we live in, which is a subject, of course, for more the psychology part. But because we live in a world where we have had to adapt our ways, not into what would be a natural flow according to nature and the day and our organisms and such, but more into one of productivity and socialization, being able to live amongst others and such, we have had to alter the way we do things. So it means that very early on, we were already out of our own flow and we were not living according to our personal constitution, which means that we were actually quite early on already in a state of imbalance. Then Ayurveda said, okay, let's look at it from a different perspective. If you're already out of balance, how do we then get you back into balance in order for it to not be one of these quick fixes kind of ways, in order for it to be sustainable? Okay, if we can't be preventative, how can we be sustainable instead in order for the balance to come back into its natural being and us to start being preventative again? I hope that makes sense to you. So, how can we do that? Well, naturally, by not shocking our system too much. So this means if I can, number one, understand what my constitution is and therefore understand what my tendencies would be, then that can be my first alarm clock whenever I realize that I'm going into my tendency. And so that for that reason, I will have small adjustments to those tendencies specifically, instead of, taking off like this huge project. Just what are my tendencies and how can I counter these tendencies by small steps as the first step to come back to balance, to come back to norm, come back to a little bit more of ease. And this is the reason you've heard me spoken about this previously, of getting oneself back to health is by then doing things just at 50% of our capacity. And this is where I then want to go into how Ayurveda brings you into your own personal rhythm without it being a quick fix. So we've spoken about the exercise part, and then what we need to do is to look into all the other parts. Now, therefore, Ayurveda have put together a routine of life, not simply a morning routine or a routine around this or that, but a routine of life. How we divide our day into different kinds of activities as a way to slowly but surely begin to make our way back into a more healthy way of being. That is called in Sanskrit dinacharya. You don't necessarily need to remember that word, but that is, if you ever hear it again, what it means. So what it means then is that we live according to our tendencies, taking them under consideration as we create our routine in life. Let's unpack that one just for a minute. In Ayurveda, there's a time of the day where each and one of the doshas, these primary constitutions, are enhanced, where they dominate nature. And so depending on your constitution, therefore your tendencies, these are also the times when you need to then have those alarm clocks a little bit more vigilant. For instance, early in the morning, just before the sun starts to rise. So somewhere between middle of the night and sunrise, there's actually specific times, but it also depends, of course, on where in the world you are and what time of the year you're in, of course. But let's say the couple of hours before sunrise is when everything is pretty light, okay? So the air is light, and nature actually, if you would be up before sunrise, you would notice that nature starts actually to wake up. Just before the sun starts to rise, you will begin to hear the birds sing, for instance. And so it's the time of the day where the atmosphere is the lightest as well, which means that the dosha of vata, the lightness, the air, the spacious one, is dominant in nature. Once the sun begins to rise, and during the hours of the morning when the sun is progressively getting stronger, the atmosphere as well then becomes heavier, because there's the, let's say, changing moment between humidity during the night and then the sun coming up as well. So right before the sun, let's say, takes over fully in the middle of the day, and between the night of the humidity, there's a moment where there's this high humidity in the air. So that's between sunrise and up until it becomes warmer, more midday kind of time. So this is early morning, mid-morning, let's say. That is when the atmosphere is heavier. And of course, because there's a little bit more than of that humidity in the air, it is the time when the heaviest of the doshas, that is kapha, is dominant. Now, naturally, as the sun progresses in the day and it comes up into its zenith, it has basically burned through the humidity and it's really nice and warm, okay? And it becomes hotter and drier a little bit more as well due to that. And that is, of course, the time of the day when the pitta, or the fiery dosha, is dominant. As we have burned through, let's say, the middle of the day, and we're starting to go a little bit more towards the afternoon, you might notice, depending on, of course, once again, the weather and seasons and such, but you might notice as well that all of a sudden in that time of the day, there's more movement. For instance, there's places where you will definitely notice it because the wind picks up sometime mid-afternoon, for instance, right? And so the humid from the morning has completely disappeared because we've gone through the hottest time of the day as well. And so it's much drier in this time. And so all of a sudden the vata is back in dominance again. The vata is back in dominance, and that will be all the way until the sun begins to set again. When the sun sets, the humidity starts to come back again because it cools down, and therefore we're going back into the kapha time of the day. When the sun has been fully gone for a while, the pitta takes over once again, and in the middle of the night, between 2 days, Pitta is once again dominant, and then it continues. So, explaining these parts of the day, knowing your own personal constitution, what you can find being difficult and what seems to be your tendencies or what you would go towards, you will then know what you need to be vigilant about. So let's say, for instance, that you're someone who has a tendency then to overheat and to burn through and to exhaust yourself in all ways of the word, actually, mentally, physically, emotionally, all of that. If you have that tendency to be very intense, then you also will know then that there's a time of the day, which is in the middle of the day, where you actually might need to make a pause to kind of balance that out. It also means that if you are that kind of person, and let's say you're someone who might not have a nice and long sleep at night, at least if you know that you're deeply asleep in the hours of the Pitta at night, you're allowing for your organism to recover much more than if you would, for instance, go to bed during that time. In the same way, if you're someone who is feeling quite sluggish, that has a tendency towards feeling sad, maybe even depressed, well, you know that your kapha might be your tendency, and in the kapha times of the day, during sunrise, for instance, and then during sunset, you will have a tendency to go even more into that sluggishness and into the depressed and sad state. So this is where you need to counter and to heat up instead in that time of the day. That also means that, for instance, in the evening, if you would have a heavy meal as a dinner quite late, when it's deep down into the kapha time, it is not helping you. On the contrary, the closer you can eat to the lighter time of the day, so closer to early sunset or even before sunset, that it is better for you. And these things, as you see, are quite small adjustments that you make that will definitely not be quick fixes, because it won't change everything about you within the next week or two. However, it is easier for you to make these small adjustments and then stick to them for a longer period of time, which means that in the long run, you will notice the changes, which will then be sustainable for you because it wasn't so difficult for you to adopt them when you were out of balance. And so naturally, when you're back into balance and you're actually feeling quite on top of the world, it will be so easy for you to do that it really then is second nature, or shall we say, once again, it is your nature. Now, the way I wanted to bring this back into the psychology perspective is that it has been proven today through neuroscience, amongst other things, that all of these principles are actually what we need as well to do on the chemical level of our brain. And the idea of bringing a quite easy to do routine is also essential for the chemical levels in our brain. I will actually in the notes of this episode put in the link to, well, a neuroscientist, biologist, who talks a lot about this in his podcast that I find really interesting, because that is also how we can, trust the information. When different sources gives us the same information, so widely spread apart that it's the Ayurvedic knowledge from 5,000 years ago, or the yoga, or completely modern scientific research from Stanford, for instance, and they're saying the same things. Now, this is how we scientifically prove that different theses are correct. And so this is what just brings so much joy to me, to listen to someone who comes from such a far away perspective from the Ayurveda and is basically confirming, not basically, is confirming exactly the same ideas. And that is also how I want to leave you with in this episode today, because I know that we get sick and tired of all this just blah blah that we find out there, the advertisement about, the quick fixes, the selling you a dream about something, how you get your perfect bikini body in 2 weeks for the summer to come, or how to get the perfect relationship as well by do this or do that. I mean, how many of these relationship videos don't you see? Oh, text him this and he will fall in love with you, or do this to her and she will be yours forever. Back in, I think the 90s probably, there was this book called, The Game, which is a horrible way for a man who explained that basically by treating her badly, she will become so addicted to you. So, right? Okay, anyway, that's a side note. But there are all these quick fixes out there, right? Where people are just trying to make fast cash on your desire to find ease and flow in life. And it doesn't work, because actually what you need to do is to go to the root cause of things, and you need to start from scratch, and you need to have patience with yourself. You need to invest in yourself. That's why I love using that in my post, that invest in yourself, because it really is that. And believe you me, I have definitely been one who did not dare to invest in myself because I was not trusting. I wasn't actually confident that by simply taking the long road, by investing in it, I would achieve what I was hoping for. And so if we don't believe it, but we can see that very opposite, let's say, sources of information confirm the same thesis, we can trust that it's solid information and that it works in the long run. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to this podcast and this episode. I am very grateful. If you enjoyed this and you think that other people could enjoy this, please help me to spread the word. Share this episode on any channel that you have of social media or messaging. And even more so, I would really appreciate if you know one other person who might benefit from my words today specifically. Take that 1 minute it takes to simply share this episode with one person. Remember that there's a human being on the other side of your phone, of your earpods, of this microphone. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what I've been talking about. So please leave a comment. Send me a message directly if you wish. This is Charlotte. This is me. See you next time. Namaste.